Hi, I'm Justin Barrett, president of Blueprint 1543.
And I am Ana Avila. Welcome to this Integrated Live, a podcast for those who seek to engage with life's biggest questions using the tools of the sciences with theology. Justin, welcome. How are you?
Oh, thanks. I'm okay. I've got a little bit of a swimmy head today.
Oh well, we're
So,
gonna have fun. It's not gonna be anything serious or too deep. We're just gonna
okay.
talk and chat. Actually, I want to start our conversation today having you react to
Okay.
some Friends clips from the show Friends, which I assume you, just like I, have watched this 10 seasons of Friends like 1,000 times. Have you?
I've certainly seen plenty of it. Yeah.
Great,
All
because
right.
that's the only way to do life, watching Friends in the background forever and ever. That's what people do. No, I
Hmm.
actually haven't done it in a while, but yeah, it's like the comfort show you put on the background when you're doing whatever. I think you already seen this because I'm pretty sure I showed it to you. But again, we're gonna watch it because it's fun
Okay.
and it's gonna be a great conversation starter, I think. So
All right.
let's watch.
All right. Let's see.
That's fine. Go ahead and scoff. You know, there are a lot of things out there that I don't believe in, but that doesn't mean they're not true.
Such as?
Like crop circles or the Bermuda Triangle or evolution.
Whoa. But you don't believe in evolution?
No, not really.
You're out of my
Believe in
fellowship.
evolution?
I don't know. It's just, monkeys, Darwin, it's a nice story. I just think it's a little too easy.
I love the reaction of the friends. They just
Too easy?
are having fun.
Yeah.
The process of every living thing on this planet evolving over millions of years from single-celled organisms is too easy?
Yeah, I just don't buy it.
Excuse me. Evolution is not for you to buy, Phoebe. Evolution is scientific fact.
That is interesting.
Like the air we breathe, like gravity.
Oh, okay. Don't get me started on gravity.
You don't believe in gravity?
Well, it's not so much that, I don't believe in it. It's just, I don't know. Lately, I get the feeling that I'm not so much being pulled down as I am being pushed.
Uh-oh, it's Isaac Newton and he's pissed.
How can you not believe in evolution?
Oh, just don't. Look at this funky shirt.
Just trying to live.
I've studied evolution my entire adult life. And I can tell you, we have collected fossils from all over the world that actually show the evolution of different species. Okay?
Is that true, though?
You can literally see them evolving through time.
It is a weird sequence.
You
He
can
just
actually
played.
see it?
You bet. In
Little
the
bird
U.S.,
to big bird.
China,
Okay.
Africa, all over.
See, I didn't know that.
Well, there you go.
Huh. So now, the real question is, who put those fossils there and why?
Hey, look at this.
Okay, Phoebes. See how I'm making these little toys move? Opposable thumb. Without evolution, how do you explain opposable thumbs?
Maybe the overlords needed them to steer their spacecrafts.
Please tell me you're joking.
Look, can't we just say that you believe in something and I don't?
No, Phoebes, we can't. Okay?
Why not?
Because
What is this obsessive need you have to make everybody agree with you? No, what's that all about? You know what? I think maybe it's time you put Ross under the microscope.
I love it.
Is there blood coming out of my ears?
Uh-oh, it's scary scientist man.
Okay, Phoebe, this is it. In this briefcase, I carry actual scientific facts. A briefcase of facts, if you will. Some of these fossils are over 200 million years old.
Okay, look,
Are they,
before
though?
you even start,
Okay.
I'm not
He should not
denying
have stolen those
evolution,
from the
okay? I'm
Yeah.
just saying
museum.
that it's one of the possibilities.
It's the only possibility, Phoebe.
This is my favorite part.
Ross, could you just open your mind like this much? Okay. Now, wasn't there a time when the brightest minds in the world believed that the Earth was flat? And up until 50 years ago, you all thought the atom was the smallest thing until you split it open and this whole mess of crap came out. Now, are you telling me that you are so unbelievably arrogant that you can't admit that there's a teeny tiny possibility that you could be wrong about this?
Rachel's having too much fun.
There might be a teeny
Man, she loaded that one up on him, did she?
possibility.
Can't believe you caved.
What?
You just abandoned your whole belief system.
Now that's not
I didn't agree with you,
fair.
but at least I respected you. How are you going to go into work tomorrow? How are you going to face the other science guys? How are you going to face yourself?
So mean, so mean.
So good.
Very well acted, yes.
That was fun. So who's hungry? I am.
That was good.
Brutal.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's one of my favorite interactions between the friends. Of course, because I'm a nerd.
No, that's a good one. It was really well put together. And I think part of why it's so funny is because it captures, there's a little seed of something real in there that a lot of us have experienced for sure, right? That whether it's the kind of conspiratorial, what about this that Phoebe sort of throws at him at first, or it's the just unswerving kind of ideological kind of sciencey person that Ross represents in some ways, right? Because when she gets him to confess that, well, okay, I might be wrong about this, there is a small chance. Now, of course, that should have been his stance to begin with.
Yeah.
So of course he can face his colleagues the next day. Of course he can look himself in the mirror, because the point of doing science is figuring out, well, where did we get things wrong and how do we keep growing and learning and figure out new stuff? But it is true. Scientists are humans like anybody else, and we get our little tribal affiliations and our ideologies that then are doing more work than they ought to in our lives, and we lose our intellectual humility. And it is the case, certainly, that evolutionary theory has become one of these sort of in-group, out-group markers, and it's a tribal kind of thing. And then it's more symbolic than it is scientific at that point when it's used that way. So, but that brilliantly done. Yeah, that episode was really great.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I think it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit about theories, scientific facts, and try to clarify these concepts for people, because I recently heard an interview where a famous journalist who's very influential talked about evolution, and he had this but it's just a theory stance. And as I was listening, I was like, I don't think you know what a theory is, like what it means, something being a theory. He just said it as it's an idea somebody had, and it hasn't been proven, but it's the popular idea of the time. And that's it. That's just the theory camp. And then we have the Rosses of the world, where he talks about evolution as scientific fact. What does it mean for something to be a scientific fact? So I don't know. I guess I would love to hear you unpack those two concepts, the concept of theory and the concept of fact.
No, you raised some really good points. One of the challenges in having a general discussion about these kinds of issues is that some of the key terms, like theory, are used in so many different ways, depending on who's using them and the context in which they're using them. So it's true that in sort of ordinary day-to-day talk, we sometimes say, oh, well, I have this theory about why da 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 da. And what you mean is, I've got an idea. I've got a
Mhm.
supposition. It's a hunch, but we use the word theory in that context sometimes. Or we talk about conspiracy theories,
Hmm.
and they're a little more elaborate, but the whole point of calling them conspiracy theories in a sort of a pejorative sort of way is to suggest they are concocted tales or accounts that don't have a lot of evidence.
Mhm.
And so those two different uses of the word theory in ordinary common discourse, then we hear a scientist talk about the theory of evolution and go, aha, it means it's a concocted story without a lot of evidence. Like, well, no, that's not what he meant by theory there. Oh, it's a guess, a hunch. Well, that's not what scientists mean by theory either. Ross does a little bit of sort of mixing these things up on his side too, right? I think it's helpful to think about there's scientists like to talk about, well, there's empirical evidence is where we typically start, usually through some kinds of observations about the world. By empirical, we just mean available to the senses, that in some way our senses, yours and mine, not just mine, but yours and mine, can observe a similar common thing out there in the world. And I'm making that distinction because there are feelings I have, like you asked me at the, when we started, how I was feeling. Well, you can't feel what I'm feeling, even though I can sense what I'm feeling. My vestibular system,
Yes.
which is a sensory system, is feeling something. Well, you can't feel that. So that's not the kind of data or evidence that we're talking about. Those are not the empirical phenomena. My report of that is something that then becomes data. It becomes evidence of something out there. But that's getting a little too technical. So there are these observations, empirical observations. So things that are out there in the world. That's evidence or data that then scientists will generate some kind of hypothesis about why they've come about, what their causes are, what their effects are, or whatever it is that we want to know. Hypotheses then are data-informed hunches, guesses. Now, they're not stupid hunches, hopefully. They need to be crafted in a certain kind of way. A good hypothesis is not just informed by the data, but by lots of other kinds of considerations about things we already know, or at least think we know. They're reasoned, and they're generally constructed in a way, at least in the sciences, when we say we have a hypothesis, and here it is, at least in the sciences today. This wasn't necessarily true 100 years ago or so, but it's certainly true today that when we say when we lay out a hypothesis, we lay it out in a way that further evidence could show that it's false. That is, it's falsifiable, is the jargon we use. We can show that it's not true in some way. If you lay out a hypothesis that cannot, at least in principle, shown to be not true, we don't generally regard that as a good scientific hypothesis. Okay, so a hypothesis is a well-informed, data-driven hunch or guess, but framed in a certain way that it could be shown to be true or false.
Yes.
And that's a really important piece of what it means to do science. And then once we go out and use those hypotheses to get more and more evidence to either confirm or reject certain kinds of hypotheses, to support these, they sort of build up on each other. And then we become a network of questions that have been answered, at least partially. And we look at all of that stuff and try to put it all under a common umbrella that captures all of the data that have been gathered, all of the evidence that we have. And usually that's what we call a theory. A theory is more of an umbrella term. And a good theory has certain properties. It's not just, it could be like this. But again, like those hypotheses, a good theory also is vulnerable to new evidence showing that it's false. And that's a really important part about a scientific theory as opposed to some other kinds of more informal senses of the word theory. So they are vulnerable to being shown to be false. They are provisional in that respect. New data could cause them to be modified in some way. But they are data-driven. They've been built up over time. So usually when we mean a theory in science, like in the scientific area, like the theory of evolution, it means something much greater than, I've got a hunch. It means there's a whole lot of data behind this. And one way of capturing all of those data points is this overarching account. And here's what that overarching account also predicts in terms of other investigations. It should be generative. A good theory is generative in that sense. It generates new research questions that then can be explored. So that's kind of the broad framework of what makes something a theory. So getting all the way to the point of a theory in the sciences is actually an achievement. It's not, you don't get to just sort of roll out of bed in the morning and, I had a funny dream and here's my new theory. It doesn't work that way. That doesn't count as a theory. That's a hunch. There might be inspiration. It might lead to a theory. But if it's not, here's all of the bodies of data that I can capture under a single account, we're not really talking about a theory at that point, at least in the sciences. So it's just a theory is kind of it's just a rhetoric when you're talking about, say, the theory of evolution. No, I mean, the whole point of Darwin's work, and especially work ever since Darwin, was try to account for all of these different sorts of data that of various sorts that he was observing. Not just he was observing, lots of people had been observing, right? What to do with all of these fossils, right? Darwin didn't collect all of the fossils. It wasn't that, Darwin in his lifetime, he discovered fossils. They'd been around. People had seen these things. There were all other kinds of considerations that went into building up his theory of evolution. And so it qualified as a theory because it was capturing lots of different sorts of data out there. Why is it that these finches on these islands have beak shapes of the kind they do? Why is it that these animals over here look like these over here, but not like these over here? Why, they're all of these whys. The fossil record is only part of it. But Ross is a paleontologist. This is why he went there.
Of course.
And so when Darwin offered a theory, it was trying to capture all of these different data sets that were already relatively agreed upon, that we have the evidence, we have these things that we have to make sense of. And can we put them all under one umbrella? And it was a generative theory in that it kept producing more research that could either challenge or support aspects of the theory. And the theory has grown and changed over time. So in the last 150 years, roughly, since Darwin, it had to take into account genetics, right? Darwin was not working with modern genetics. Genetics had to be sort of fused together with it. So it had to be a synthesis. Sometimes it is called the neo-Darwinian synthesis or things like that. And in recent decades, we've been talking more about cultural evolution and how humans, especially, one of the big pieces of that is how humans change environments such that it modifies the selective pressures on humans themselves. And how other animals have done that through what's sometimes called niche construction. And does that change the dynamics? What about group selection versus individual selection? What about, there are all of these different newer approaches to evolution that are forcing the theory to continue to adapt, to change, to expand in light of the new evidence. So in that sense, it's been a very generative kind of theory. The point of a theory then in the sciences is to capture a whole bunch of data, but to also generate new questions that can be explored productively. And if it's not doing that work, then maybe it's turned into something else, like an ideology. We don't usually, as scientists, talk about, but is it true or false? And if you don't believe it, then you're not a scientist. Well, it's not really the way that it should go. But sadly, especially with evolutionary theory, that is the way it has gone in a lot of circles, that somehow, if you don't believe every single aspect of a particular version of evolutionary theory, then you're somehow not a scientist. And that's just silly tribalism. And that's tiresome and unfortunate. But in some ways it's understandable, especially in the American context where whether we believe in evolution, whether we teach evolution, has become such a fraught public issue.
Yes.
And because of the kind of society we are and the sciences are funded publicly and everything else, the public does have an interest in how scientists operate. So thorny, complicated stuff. The Friends episode is more fun.
No, I mean, we need to really understand these things, because if we just stay with Phoebe was, she was a troll. She just had their idea.
Totally trolled him. Totally. It was awesome.
And that was fun. But she was like, you believe these, I believe that, and it doesn't matter. Now it matters. It matters. We need to communicate. We want to pursue truth. We want to see the world the way the world actually is. And sometimes there's disagreement and we can agree to disagree, but we also can have constructive dialogue that helps us, get to a point of shared knowledge, and we say, okay, now we see things differently and we agree in some sense. So I guess I wanted to ask, this generative aspect of the theory of evolution that you say it has, you explained it as a good thing, but most people believe that is a bad thing, or at least that's what I've heard. Like, oh, look, they aren't even agreeing within each other, or they change the theory all the time to fit whatever new data is coming up. So that means they just wanted to force the theory to fit reality, but it doesn't actually fit. So is that a fair assessment, a fair criticism, or are we missing something about how theories work?
I think most of those criticisms are unfair, that they are missing something about how theories work. Theories, what has not changed. So it would be the case. It would be a fair criticism if the theory is so flexible that it can accommodate any evidence. And like,
you're thinking about other frames of thought that do that, right?
Well, there are some out there. So this has been one of the critiques of Freudian psychoanalysis, for instance, as a theory of how human minds work. It seems that Freud's whole framework, at least, there are a few things that he could nail down a little more precisely, but his general framework was so flexible that to put it in the sort of philosophical jargon, both P and not P, proposition P being true and it being false, would both count as evidence for. Well, if you find something and you don't find something and they both count as evidence for a theory, that's a problem.
Yes.
Some older theories that have been discarded, and Freudian psychoanalysis is one of those. Scientific psychologists do not regard that as a sound scientific theory. It has been relegated to the historical dustbin.
Okay.
Even if Freud still had a few interesting observations and some language that we still use, we don't accept his theory as a good, well-grounded scientific theory. And partly it had evidential problems, but partly it was just a coherence problem. It was framed poorly so that, like I said, evidence both for and against could be counted for. Well, that's a problem. And that's not the case with most aspects of evolutionary theory. It's not the case that if I find this species having these features and I don't find this species having these features, they both count as evidence for evolution. So that's not what's going on. What is going on is that the general evolutionary framework has some areas that are underspecified.
Okay.
Think of it more like, I don't know, for lack of a better kind of thing, think of it as a big blanket. But that when it was initially put together is kind of thin and patchy, and there's some thin spots, and people really did put literal patches. Okay, we need to accommodate this and this and this. Now, at a certain point, if a theory looks like it turns out to all be patches, there wasn't any structure behind it at all, those do get overturned. And we have these little minor scientific revolutions. We have not seen that with evolutionary theory. What we've seen is, okay, it's doing a pretty good job for all of this this sort of data. But what about this over here? The genetic stuff. Well, we didn't have genetics when Darwin was doing his work. Now we have to accommodate genetics too. Can genetics fit with it? Lo and behold, it can. And it leads to some sort of slight changes and so forth. So I think the general criticism that, it keeps accommodating data, that shows it's slippery. Well, that's just not a fair criticism. A good scientific theory does, because it's not meant to be an ideology, right? Yes. An ideology has a problem taking on board new evidence. A scientific theory should take on new evidence. But I think in a lot of, especially the battles between, and it's unfortunate that I would have to use that language, but I think it's accurate, the battles between certain faith communities and evolutionary theory, they're viewing evolutionary theory as a competing ideology with, say, the Christian faith. So Christianity is ideological to a certain extent. There are certain things, no, we don't give up. If we do, it's gone. The Apostle Paul said, if Jesus didn't rise, we're to be pitied. We're done. Game over. So there are certain kinds of data. If we turned out, we find Jesus's bones and it's indisputable, Christianity's dead.
Yes.
And you should give it up. So in that sense, while it's empirically vulnerable, it's got a different flavor to it. It's a worldview. Well, evolution isn't supposed to be that. It's not supposed to be ideological in that way. But because so many people set it up, some of its early champions, like A.D. White, the first president of Cornell University, was one of these big champions of evolution. And he tried to set it up as a competitor against Christianity. And so Christians responded in kind. They're like, oh, it's a competitor, then we're going to treat it like an ideology because you're basically saying that it is. Well, that was a mistake. We should not have taken the bait from White. It turns out one of the reasons he was doing that kind of shenanigans is because he was at the beginning of this university, Cornell University. That was the first of these major private universities being founded in the United States without any faith connection. So Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all of these, they had an affiliation with a church initially. Cornell didn't. And White was trying to create space for a completely secular university. And at the time, that was a difficult thing to do. So he did some historical and intellectual shenanigans to try to create space. And he went too hard in the opposite direction. He basically tried to argue against faith through some of this scientific work. And of course, Christians felt threatened because they were being threatened. He was deliberately threatening them. But then they responded in a defensive kind of posture, and it set up, at least in the United States, this long series, and he wasn't the only one. He's just, comes to mind as an easy example. This long series of these ideological arguments over evolution instead of saying, no, it's not that kind of thing. It's not supposed to be a worldview. We're not supposed to get our values from it. We're not supposed to get morality from it. It's not an ideology. It's a theory that's supposed to be generative. It's supposed to change and accommodate new findings over time to the effect that it can. And when it can't, it needs replaced, or it needs at least major revisions and overhauls. And we've been seeing those revisions and overhauls. And that's a good thing as far as a scientific theory goes.
Yes. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about how the conversation went wrong. So what can we say about how to make the conversation right? Because we still
look at you getting all positive.
Yes, please. Let's talk about happy things. A happier
I like
future.
I like that.
If you had a magical wand and Dr. Justin Barrett could make the conversation on evolution within Christianity better, what would you change?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if a magic wand is even required. Fortunately, I think that it just should speed things up, I suppose.
Yes, you're an optimist then.
I think one of the really important things for both Christians and their opponents to recognize is that really not that much is at stake. So we got to bring the temperature down.
Okay.
Evolution, through these natural selection kinds of mechanisms, is not at its heart inconsistent with a high view of Scripture or the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith. I think if Christians can recognize that, that doesn't mean there aren't some little friction points. There are going to be some friction points, but they are not the kinds of friction points that mean we must abandon the faith if evolution is true. No, who told you that? That's just false.
Well, we can.
I mean, yeah, we can make a list. We can make a list. And
we won't, though.
We shouldn't, because that's divisive, and they're being divisive. And sure, if you, man, especially if you're reading your New Testament, boy, the Apostle Paul has a whole lot of really hard things to say about people who are divisive and trying to split up the church and tell people that they're not Christ followers for all kinds of peripheral reasons. And I sadly think this is one of those issues. So I think there's that. But let's bring the temperature down and recognize this is not a salvation issue, whether you believe in evolution or not. It doesn't mean you aren't a Christ follower. It doesn't mean you don't respect the authority of Scripture either.
Yes.
It does mean you need to be able to answer some questions for sure about how to make sense of the authority of Scripture, how to make sense of the gospel message in light of evolution, if evolution is true. But there are sincere Christ followers and very smart people who are coming up with at least what I take to be fairly plausible accounts of this. Now, confession, I didn't originally agree with them in this regard. And there are still some of those accounts that I think are somewhat problematic. But of course, that's going to be the case. This isn't simple stuff. And smart people who have their hearts in the right place and love Jesus are going to disagree on some of these things. Again, this is not a salvation issue. It doesn't really matter in that regard. We're also going to disagree about, which country plays the best soccer or football, whichever language you want to use there. I mean, we're going to disagree on some of these things. It's not only important for people in the church to recognize, I think it's important for the attackers on the outside. A lot of this kind of conflict, especially around evolution, has really been driven by a subset of particularly vocal new atheists, as they're sometimes called. And I'm not just making that up. Sociological research of recent years is suggesting just that. And psychological cross-cultural studies that is coming out here, and really right about now, some of this research is starting to come out, seems to suggest that actually it's a small percentage of even atheists who are using this as a rhetorical tool to attack people of faith. And I find it very unnerving when Bible-believing Christians think that they have strong alignment with some of these new atheists ideologically. And I've heard this on their radio programs, and it made me cringe. I mean, I'm driving down the highway, and I'm not going to name names because we don't need to do that.
No.
But I heard somebody basically quote a famous, world-famous new atheist saying, "See, he's right." And I'm like, okay, what just happened here? But they're right, that they are kindred spirits in the sense of they both misunderstand the gravity of evolutionary theory. They think it does more than it does. If we believe in God as the creator and sustainer of the natural world, God is at work through all natural processes. If God stops God's activity in the natural world, it ceases to exist.
Yes.
Well, that means God is actually the sustainer of however atoms work, however subatomic particles work, however string theory, if it's true, works, however dark matter, if it exists, works, and however evolution, if it exists, works. That's part of his process too. And so this idea of, well, did God do it or did evolution? It's just a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be talking that way, because that's bad theology at that point. It's not that it's bad science, it's bad theology.
I agree with that. not sure I agree with the soccer comparison. I mean, I don't care about soccer at all.
And maybe not the best example, but know.
Because I do think like most people, most of the time are not thinking about these things like Christians. I have very knowledgeable Christian friends who are very into theology and reading their Bibles and thinking about how the world works. And very few of them are interested in the evolutionary theory thing.
That's right.
They're just, most people are just like, that seems iffy. Like, I don't want to think that we come from an animal. That doesn't seem to fit with the Imago Dei. So I don't think that's true. And that's it. Like, most people go that way. It's more comfortable for their theological sensitivities to say, like, we are completely unique and special. We were made miraculously. Is that a word?
Yeah, no, you nailed it.
Milagrosamente by a God who, I don't know, he didn't use animals. That's the point to get to us. So yeah, even the fact of calling ourselves animals freaks them out. So that's why they stay away from evolution. They are not dogmatic about it. They're just weirded out by it.
Yeah.
So I do think the turning down the heat, realizing that, okay, it's not that crucial for us to come to a definitive conclusion about the process through which God created, maybe. That's a good thing. But I do believe that for many people, this is something that goes directly to our identity, who we are, what we come from, what that says about us. Again, I don't have like set in stone position on this issue. I'm still studying. But I do not have a problem thinking God used a natural process that lasted millions of years to get to us. I don't have a problem with that. And I don't have a problem as, like, for me, like, the dust of the earth is just as non-human and non-imago Dei as some biological form.
Yeah. I mean, if one of the concerns is, well, it just seems creepy that we, have animal ancestors, like, you have mud ancestor. I mean, the biblical account, right, at least of Adam and Eve, Adam is, his name even reflects it, right? It's at least some Hebrew scholars have suggested his name suggests the earthy one. He's made out of clay. What is clay? All kinds of just muck and stuff. It was meant to say you're not much.
Yes.
And the biblical story is full of you're not much. Your worth is not based on the stuff you are made of. It's not based on your ancestry. Oh, if our worth is based on our ancestry, look at the ancestry of humans. It's horrible, right? The worth of even the chosen people of God, if you read their history, right, which is our biblical text, it's not because they're great. They're horrible people in their ancestry. Well, we all have horrible people in our ancestry. That's not our worth. Our worth is because God says, I love you.
Amen.
And so so the aesthetic kind of things, it's an aesthetic argument. I feel funny about the idea that I'm descended of an animal. I'd much rather be descended of mud. Really? Really? How about of murderers? Because you're descended of murderers and rapists and, that too. That's what you're descended of. Now, do you feel better? Not so much, because that's not where our worth is supposed to come from.
Yes.
So I don't like that one as a.
I honestly feel that's.
But I get it, sort of on a certain level.
Yes.
I get it, because I grew up with that too. In fact, I remember learning this song. I'm no kin to the monkey, monkey's no kin to me. I don't know about your ancestors, but mine didn't swing from a tree.
We in Latin America had a little boy who preached, el mono y la mona producen monitos, which means the male monkey and female monkey produce little monkeys.
Little monkeys, yeah.
And he screamed. Is that a word? No, that's not a word. We've talked about it. Screamed.
He screamed.
He was just loud, and everyone was really proud of this preacher boy who talked against evolution. Anyways, yeah, we all have our yeah.
And there is, I get not being comfortable with evolution for lots of reasons. I mean, I think those are kind of silly reasons, but there are other reasons that make evolution hard to sort of, one of the things is, well, the depth of time, right? Because our intuitions are right on this. For this to make sense, the amount of time required is just unfathomable. Yeah. Is that a word? Fathomable. And, yeah, you said it better than I did. It's not fair. You're better in both languages. And it is. Our brains are meant for shorter periods of time than that. And so thinking about the hundreds of millions of years that are required for this, that's just, it just doesn't compute. It's like, I got nothing. That doesn't make sense. So there's that. That's, I think, one of the biggest obstacles. We also have a tendency toward what's called essentialism, essentialist thinking. When we come into the world and we start categorizing things and figuring out what's what and so forth, we do think, the Papa Mono and the Mama Mono are going to have monitos. Yes. They're going to have baby of the same kind of thing, because that's just how our brains sort of categorize and make sense of the world. And again, it makes perfect sense within our historical frameworks. It makes good sense. You have to do really weird shenanigans, again, like breeding horses and donkeys or lions and tigers, which people have done, to get something that's sort of in between. But it does happen in nature sometimes. So there are these Pizzly bears or growler bears.
That is a terrible name, Pizzly.
Yeah, Pizzlies and growlers. So when a grizzly bear and a polar bear make babies, I don't know which is better, growler or Pizzly.
I like I cannot pronounce it, but Pizzly sounds like piss.
Hey, watch your language.
Is that too bad of a word in English? I don't know. I learned my English on TV.
So that already sort of does something funny to the way our minds naturally carve up the world. And because we think there's then a common essence, and evolution seems to suggest there aren't these essential boundaries the same way between species. That's hard for us to think. That doesn't mean it's false. It just means it's not the normal way that our brain thinks about things in the world. So that's another that kind of rubs against. And the third, and maybe the most important one, is actually the directionlessness or purposelessness.
Yes.
So at least what you might call naturalistic evolutionary theory, that is, evolutionary theory assuming there is no God involved.
Yes.
It has no real direction to it. It has no purpose. It has no meaning other than for this sort of biological kind to have better fitness, and outcompete others, or at least compete well enough against its environment to keep making babies and survive. That's pretty thin. And when researches by some really clever psychologists have shown that we naturally come into the world and see living things, but also non-living things as having design and purpose. And especially ourselves, we see ourselves as having meaning and purpose. And to sort of pretend that to assert that none of that applies to all of the stuff around us, that's really jarring. Now, interestingly,
you talked about this in your book, Born Believers, right?
Yeah, that's right. That is in the book, Born Believers.
Little commercial break.
Yes. Why, thank you for that. Yeah. We do talk about why it is that evolutionary theory really is in many respects counterintuitive, and it takes a whole lot of cultural investment for people to not just learn it right and get it. and let alone believe it. It takes some cultural investment because it is counterintuitive, and it's not for no reason that it took a long time for it to be developed, and that it is not only contested by people still today, 150 years later, but also that it's misunderstood by so many people.
Yes.
But that purposelessness that one is especially important because it's an add-on, right? It's not a fundamental feature of the theory. It's an additional feature of the theory that is added on if you assume that God is not behind it all.
Yes.
So if this is one of the tools God used to bring about us, and this isn't denying that God might not periodically sort of specially create things. Maybe God has done that. Maybe God specially creates Adam and Eve as well, even if there's this broader population of humans.
Bum, bum, bum.
Right? Both of those could be true at the same time. That, Homo sapiens evolved from Homo erectus and some of these other Homo, which just means human or man or whatever. Maybe evolution is the right story. And God said, yeah, but I'm going to make two special ones. Maybe he did that. I mean, he did. We certainly, Christians all agree, he made at least one special one in Jesus, where he did a very different kind of process to bring him about. So maybe he did it previously to select a specific kind of lineage of people that he would have a special relationship with, who would act as this intermediaries between God and the rest of creation. And he put them in this special temple-like garden. That's one account. That makes sense of the biblical text, and it's consistent with the evolutionary kind of story as well. But he made them similar enough, maybe even basically biologically identical to these other Homo sapiens. What was different is that he chose them and picked them and pulled them out to have a special relationship with them so that they could have special status. But they were close enough to the rest that then they end up intermarrying with everybody else. I'm not advocating this view necessarily. I'm not against this view necessarily. I'm just saying there are many more options available than we realize. And some of them are consistent with evolution, and they bring in that purpose kind of direction. Because another way to say it is, no, God used an evolutionary process to purposefully bring about a very special kind of animal that had the capacities to be his representatives, his image bearers, his priests on this earth, to exercise stewardship, to develop character and morality and everything else. And so evolution is purposeful. It is directional in some ways. And interestingly, contemporary evolutionary theorists are starting to, even those who are not necessarily believers, they don't necessarily believe in God, they're starting to notice there are some interesting patterns in evolution. We don't have time to talk about all of these patterns, but things like convergent evolution, it's called, that it seems like over and over again, similar kinds of animals arise independently, or similar structures like human eyes or camera eyes are a good example. That seems like it's evolved independently multiple times, maybe at least 9 up to 23, who knows, lots of times. They're common solutions. So, and one of the most interesting moves in some of this space is the idea that cooperation, or even what we sometimes looks like altruism, is a direction in evolution. We see overall, if you look at the evolutionary story, a move from independent little things to more and more cooperating units, until you get to these big social units that we've got today. That growing cooperation, or even growing cooperation at my own expense, what you might call altruism, the expense of the individual, is a theme or a direction in evolution. So even that idea of purposeless, directionlessness, lack of design in evolution, that's, like I was saying, that was an add-on to the theory based on certain worldviews.
Yes.
It is starting to get shakier even within some of just plain old secular mainstream evolutionary science. And it was never necessary for Christians to adopt that. so much more could be said about this, of
So much
course.
more, yes.
But I think the general idea is not to be sort of knee-jerk about rejection of evolution on the wrong basis. If you're going to reject evolution, do it for the right reasons,
Yes.
not the wrong
Yes.
reasons. If you're going to embrace it for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons.
Yep.
But certainly, let's bring the temperature down. Whether somebody thinks that evolutionary theory is the best account for how to make sense of the biological diversity we see is not a salvation issue. It does not necessarily push them outside of God's grace. It doesn't make them enemy. And it does not mean they can't be sincere Christ followers who have a high view of Scripture. These people exist. There are lots of them. And you and I know some of these people.
Yes.
So let's be kind and a little more patient and intellectually humble about all of this, and not make it a Ross and Phoebe kind of issue where people's feelings get hurt and they feel attacked.
Yeah. And we can, like, if people have questions about this, they can send them to us, and if we gather enough of them, we can do an extra episode of you talking through all of these questions, specific questions people have. But before we go, I know you've had a journey with this topic. You haven't always believed what you believe about evolution. So I was wondering if you could give us your advice for people who are starting to explore this topic. We already set the stage regarding the fact of, like, it's not that big of a deal. You can chill, you can relax. Your salvation doesn't hinge on this. You can take your time to explore and look at the evidence and either embrace or reject this theory based on fact and research. But if people want to get into those facts and those research, where will you point them to?
Well, I'll start with just some friendly, guy with gray hair advice, and that's examine your motivations. Why do you want to dig into this? Now, it may be because you're studying in a science area, or you are a practicing scientist and you've been pushing aside whether to get into this or not, and you've decided it's time to sort of come to grips and figure out what you think about this. That's fine. But are you getting into it because you just like the fight? Are you getting into it because you want to score intellectual points? Are those good motivations? If you're going in with bad motivations, you're probably not going to approach the evidence the right way. You're not going to get into the space and be fair about it. So I would first examine your motivations. Once you've done that, then where can you go? There are a number of pretty good resources out there. Some of them have different angles on them. One of the things I find helpful, especially for those of us I will go ahead and say in the Americas, not just in English-speaking America, but also in Spanish-speaking America, because we share a whole lot of information up and down the Americas.
Really up to down. Anyway.
Except for the culinary arts. They're definitely moving the other way in some really positive ways.
Those don't need revision, though.
And yet we do anyway.
Oh, no.
We'll talk about tacos some other time.
Yes.
And Mexican hot dogs. I mean, they're delicious. They're really
Yes, they are.
So it's especially where now I sidetracked myself.
In the Americas.
I find it helpful actually to look at what people outside of the Americas are saying, because there isn't the same kind of political baggage and theological history. And so for that reason, you might check out a lot of the resources, the multimedia resources that the Faraday Institute has. So that is a Cambridge, England-based organization. They've had speakers in there. Some are not believers, but many are. Talk about many of these different kinds of science issues from different angles. And so you get a really nice, rich array of materials there. And what's kind of nice is because they're coming from more of a British and European kind of perspective, you start seeing where certain cultural issues just don't matter to them in the same way. And that's kind of helpful. I find that helpful. That doesn't mean I'm endorsing or agreeing with all that they put out there, but it's thought provoking and usually very, good quality stuff and discussions. Similarly, I find myself turning a lot to the Biologos's materials online. They've got a lot of materials, a little bit hard to find sometimes, but they've got good discussions. And again, they have deliberately invited disagreements where they've got people of different perspectives. And again, some of their writers I don't find as convincing as others, but I find all of them, or at least the vast majority of them, fair-minded, and their hearts are in the right place. I know a lot of people who have been affiliated with Biologos, and I know that they're sincere Christ followers who are really trying to do their best with these challenging topics and trying to not be divisive. In fact, Biologos events, they often open with worship, and I think that's just and close with worship, and it's a wonderful thing. So I think the Biologos has a lot of good resources too. So those are two of my favorite kind of repositories. You probably have some thoughts on this too. In fact, you probably have done more recent reading on this than I have. So
I do agree with the Europe British situation. When I visited Cambridge, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we were in a science and religion event, and I was amazed of how a non-issue evolution was. Like, it was not a big deal. It was like something you could discuss and have different takes on, different opinions, and it was not as charged. And that was really great for me because, I can talk about this and nobody's gonna look at me like I'm crazy or think that I'm not a Christian all of a sudden because I have questions. So yes, I do agree. And a little book on 4 views, creation, intelligent design, and evolution. I think that's a great starter primer to get an overview of the most common views on creation. I've really enjoyed that book, and it presents the majority views on this topic. Not all of them, but you get a taste, and you can get resources to go into intelligent design or evolution or creation, older creationism, and all that. I really enjoyed that book, and it has helped me in my journey to explore this topic, which I'm still going through, and that's fun. And I think that's the greatest part of it, that when I was in college and learning about evolution as a biologist, having grown up as a Christian who was a very much young earth creationist who thought that was like the only option I had, I was anxious to just have all the answers and all, and be able to just win every argument and such. But now that I'm older and wiser, I know that I can just explore. And of course, these are important topics. I don't want it to come across like, we can just agree to disagree and all is in good faith and fun, and there are no implications of any of this. Of course, there are implications, and sometimes they're important ones. So I don't want to minimize the weight some people give to this topic, but at the same time, I want people to realize that you can take the time you need to explore this topic with fairness. You don't have to feel like you have to have all the answers. I don't even think you have all the answers. Even you have a more solid position than I do on this topic. You don't come across as these are all the answers and that's it.
I agree with you. I didn't start feeling like I had any kind of confident footing in this stuff until I was toward the end of my doctoral studies.
Yeah.
So, and I can't tell, as you noted earlier, it doesn't matter to our day-to-day life.
Yes.
It doesn't matter to the primary things that we're called to do in terms of, loving God and loving others, taking care of our family, being a good friend. It's not one of those types of things. And so being patient,
Yes.
Being measured, being careful, is perfectly right thing to do. And I guess I just want to highlight there's a real danger with a lot of these intellectual topics, especially when we're trying to figure out how certain ways of, knowing about the world, like science stuff or history or philosophy, how it fits with scripture-based theological kinds of reflections, that we can inadvertently turn all of this, especially our reading of the Bible, into an intellectual exercise and a puzzle for us to solve.
Yeah.
And that puts us in the wrong relationship, especially with what scripture is supposed to be doing for us. It's a resource for us to cultivate our relationship with God. And if we turn it into a puzzle for us to solve, we're suddenly in charge of that. And it's not a relational tool anymore. It's an intellectual kind of game for us to play. And for those of us who are smart people, it can play into our ego too quickly. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, look how clever I am. I figured this out. That kind of stuff, where it's like, if this was absolutely an essential thing for us, it would be a lot clearer. It'd be a lot easier to get straightforward. So I think, again, having the right attitude going into this is really important. And I think you highlighted some of these right things, that being patient, slow, measured, and having your motivation in the right place. And be careful because like many of these thorny topics, it's easy just to kind of, puff ourselves up and look how clever I am. I figured this one out. That's not what's important. In your particular vocation, your calling, your context, it may be important for you to be able to talk intelligently about these issues, because maybe you're surrounded by sciencey people and you're finding that your inability to talk intelligently and comfortably about these is an obstacle maybe to your witness or your ability to disciple other people effectively, or whatever it is. Well, then by all means, let's make progress on these things, but let's do it with that proper spirit and motivation.
Yes, and amen. Thank you, Justin. It was a great conversation. I'm sure it's just the beginning of it.
Thanks for springing this one on me.
Yes, I love it. And I have some interesting things planned for the future. So
she never tells me in advance what we're going to talk about. It's always a surprise.
So we're glad for all of you who have stuck with us to the end. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask them. And if we gather enough of them about evolution, we might do another episode on this topic. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.